Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinars today. My name is Michael Barton. I'm Chair of Professional Affairs for the Canadian Medical and Biological Engineering Society. Very happy for you to join us today. Today, I believe you would have understood from the invitation, but just to confirm, today we're going to try something new and wonderful. We have, as most people know, almost two halves to our membership. One is more academic and one more is hospital-based. And we usually only get together in a very nice kind of integrated way at our conference time. And of course, with COVID, we are not able to do the conference this year. So we wanted to try something new because one of the really base facilities that we like to provide for the Canadian populace is that we give a platform for our students and young engineers to present and be part of a community before they launch into the careers. So we really wanted to reinforce that starting today. So starting today, very first inaugural event is with Ottawa and Carleton group. So we're going to welcome Dr. Marie-Ange Janvier and a couple of her students and her team to present their research. And we're very happy that this is our inaugural event, and it is our firm intention to have a number of the universities right across Canada to present in this fashion. So we get to see some fantastic work done by some really good up-and-coming engineers in Canada. So to not chew up too much time from our young engineers, I did first want to introduce Marie-Ange Janvier. She's a certified clinical engineer who works at Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, CHEO, in Ottawa. So she has a PhD in biomedical engineering from Université de Montréal Polytechnique, as well as a degree in electrical engineering from University of Ottawa. So she's actually also a licensed professional engineer in both Ontario and Quebec. 2017, she was awarded the Early Career Achievement Award, congratulations, by CMBES. And not only is she currently a member of the CMBES exec, but she's our chair of bilingual affairs. She's also a member of the American College of Clinical Engineers and is the past chair for the Canadian Board of Examiners for the CCE. She comes to us today, however, in her role as a part-time professor. She's very busy, clearly, whereas she has an adjunct professor standing with both the Department of Mechanical Engineering at University of Ottawa and the Department of Systems and Computer Engineering at Carleton University. So we welcome Marie-Ange along with her students, and we're very much looking forward to hearing of the research. Marie-Ange, would you like to introduce your students?
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for the nice introduction. That's very nice. I'm so excited for you guys to hear about the students that are graduating this year from the OCIBME program in clinical engineering concentration. So the first student that we're having is Lama. So Lama is a recent University of Ottawa graduate and with a Master's of Engineering degree in Biomedical Engineering with concentration in clinical engineering. Her passion for clinical engineering began when she took a clinical engineering course in her last semester of her biomedical and electrical undergraduate studies. She has also just started working at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston as a full-time clinical engineering. This is during her break right now that she's doing this talk. And she's one of our, Kim Greenwood and I supervise the students at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. So Lama, the floor is up to you right now.
Actually, just before you start, Lama, I was remiss in talking to the audience. So the format that we're going to use is Lama's going to speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes of questions specifically on her talk. And then we'll have a 15-minute presentation by Eduardo, and then 5 minutes of questions, and then a 15-minute presentation by Chris, and then 5 minutes questions. So my apologies for that. Go ahead, Lama.
Thank you so much, Marie-Ange and Michael. I'm very happy to be here today and to present the project that I worked on during my master's degree. And the project was with the assessment of VLR's infusion pump controllers, model number 8105, and I was just evaluating the PM effectiveness at CHEO. So the topics that I'll cover today in this presentation are here. I'm going to start with the Alaris infusion system, The system is a modular smart pump system that has the capability of being a single, double, triple, or quad pump. It is the only infusion system that can deliver multiple modalities of IV medication. The modules are large volume, syringe, PCA, SpO2, and tidal CO2. At CHIO, we only have the large volume pump modules and the central point of care unit, which is right here in the middle. This central point of care unit that was in the middle is the focus of the project, and it's used as the brain of the system, and it's used for programming all the infusions. The Alaris infusion system can be used in a variety of different settings at the hospital, so you can find it in chemotherapy, pain management, total current flow management, and anesthesia or sedation. Due to the limited timing of this project, I was only able to examine the modules. So the brain of the system, sorry, not the modules, but the brain of the system that programs the infusion. And I wasn't able to look at the other modules that together in Photoshop. And that's just because of the limited timing of the project, because I was only at CHIO for 8 months during my master's. So what is preventive maintenance and why is it important? Medical devices require equipment maintenance to ensure they keep performing as they should. Preventive maintenance is scheduled and planned maintenance, and each medical device has its own maintenance procedure. For the brain or the unit that was the focus of this project, whenever the technician receives the unit to do the PM, he or she connects it to a system that so once it's connected to its maintenance system, these things show up. So the technician knows that they have to do an instrument inspection where they just inspect the device for any physical damage, and then they do a simultaneous and they have to check the simultaneous display where red, blue, and so different lights are shown just to ensure that the entire display works and can detect the different colors. And then the IUI connectors get inspected by attaching modules on the right side and the left side and making sure that the control units can detect them. The alarms sound to make sure they all work and are audible. The keypad, every single button on the keypad gets pressed, so to make sure it works. And then the ground leakage and the ground resistance get tested, the values for them get tested. And lastly, the device sets a default PM reminder date, which is a year from the date the PM is performed. So in addition to that, CHIO has a 2-year battery replacement policy because the technicians, when they were doing the training for this maintenance by the manufacturer has said that it's best to replace the batteries every 2 years. So the project objective was to firstly evaluate the effectiveness of the current manufacturer's recommended PM procedure for the Alaris infusion pump controllers, and to find ways, if any, to optimize the time and cost spent on maintaining these controllers at CHIO. I started this project with the assumption that the PM is effective in terms of procedure and interval and should be kept as is. So how did I examine the PM effectiveness? Number one, by identifying the main reasons of device failure and checking that the PM procedure includes checking these failure reasons to verify keeping the manufacturer's PM procedure. Number two was to check the frequency of performed PMs and ensure that they comply with what is required by the manufacturer to verify keeping the manufacturer's PM interval. So the first thing was for the procedure, second thing was for the interval. I also wanted to calculate the mean time between failure because that's a very important parameter in determining the interval of the PM. And lastly, I just wanted to look at adjusting the PM procedure if possible to optimize the use of resources while maintaining safety. So the pumps at CHIO, we have a count of 229 controllers. The majority of them were installed in October 2015, and the manufacturer recommends a PM every 360 days. The pumps are distributed all over the hospital, and there's a pump room that is responsible for collecting the pumps or making sure they're ready for next use whenever they are requested. I had 6 years of preventive and repair maintenance data, and these were obtained from the CMMES of CHIO. There were two main tables that I used to extract the data. The first one was the service call problem codes, And this had basically a description of the device, count, and that kind of stuff. And then the second one had like the type of call, whether it was PM or repair. It had the equipment number, the work order number, the enter date, repair code, and call description. At SHIO, a work order is generated for every maintenance event of a device. The work orders are coded by type of maintenance, PM or repair, and the work order types categorize the service performed. Work order types for maintenance, no problem found, recalls, and other risk categories are tracked for the equipment failure codes and problem summaries. So using the data in the repair code service call sheet and with the aid of Excel's pivot table, I was able to do some data analysis to find results for what I was looking for. These are the problem codes and the repair codes that are associated with the controllers. I know they're not that clear, but I do have pie charts in the next two slides that better represent them. So here we had the problem codes that were associated with these controllers, and the three main reasons, problem codes used were: number one, no failure associated with the work order PM. Number two was component failure, which is the battery specifically, and number three was miscellaneous work. Miscellaneous was further evaluated and analyzed, and it appeared to include number one, battery conditioning, number two, frayed power cords, and number three, user errors. So that was for the problem codes. The repair codes, this is the slide that had the repair codes. So the five main repair codes that were associated with these controllers appeared to be: number one, preventive maintenance complete; number two, repairs completed; number three, battery replacement; number four, functional verification; and lastly, parts replacement. I have gone over the work orders and I had classified them as effective or ineffective. So, and these were specifically for the PM work orders. The effective PMs were the ones where the tech performed the steps required by manufacturer for PM, and device did not fail in the next 12 months or until next PM, whichever happens first, due to PM preventable failure. The ineffective PM was classified as one where the battery replacement didn't occur, although it was supposed to occur, and therefore the device had come down to the shop due to a battery failure in the next 12 months. The percentage of effective PMs were 82%. The percentage of ineffective PMs were only 18%. However, I realized that time is actually wasted on PMs that are done less than 12 months apart. So although the manufacturer recommends PM every 12 months or 360 days, a lot of PMs were, for so many controllers, were done with a duration less than 12 months apart. And this was, so I looked at the reason for that, and this was mainly because all the PMs get scheduled at the same month. For all 229 devices, and the devices don't have device locators, and they are all over the hospital. So it's very difficult for the technicians to actually locate them when it's time for PM, and to actually finish all the PMs in 1 month for the 229 devices. So when I looked at the duration, I got a percentage of how many PMs were actually done less than 12 months apart. And these were 47.8% of the time. So in other words, 47.8% of the time, we were overdoing the PMs. I also looked at the repair work orders and classified them as number one, PM preventable equipment failure, and that was that represented the batteries that were due for 2-year replacements but were not replaced. Number two was the unpreventable failure, and that included a manufacturer recall, broken equipment, and random repairs, as well as frayed power cords and battery reconditioning. Number three was the user error, and these were the failures that could have been prevented by better staff training on the use of these devices. Number four was the failure due to late PM, and this included the failures that may have been prevented had the PM actually occurred at its scheduled time. So only 31% of all the repair work orders were actually PM preventable failures. And these are the definitions that I just mentioned, or they are there for your reference. Furthermore, while going over the work orders, I was reading the call description, which is basically the note that comes with the pump when they get sent down to the shop. And from there, it appeared that for the most part, these controllers get sent down to the shop for three main reasons. Number one being batteries, and this can include two things. Either the battery needs reconditioning or the battery is due for replacement. And number two was the freight power cord. I actually before that, so I went over our data and looked at how many times we changed the batteries, and I did this chart. The battery replacement seems to peak every 2 years, which confirms that the batteries need to be replaced at every 2 years, but unfortunately that's not always the case. The second reason these controllers get sent down to the shop is due to freight power cords, and I also looked at the data and how the power cords are getting replaced. And from the data, it appeared that as these controllers age, their power. And lastly, we have these devices come to the shop because the clinical staff is not trained on handling of clinical advisories such as occlusion and device load, air and line, and so forth. And that's because CHIO is a training hospital, so we always have like new nurses that come to CHIO for a short while, and then they go to other places. The mean time between failure appeared to be 11.4 months, which confirms that the 12 months should be kept, the 12 months interval of the PM should be kept as is. With that being said, I did come up with a few recommendations that I believe should optimize the resources that we have at CHIO that we use for maintenance. The first recommendation was to strictly stick to the rigid 12 months PM interval to avoid overdoing the PM and missing battery change date. And this can happen by maybe dividing up the fleet into 12 groups and scheduling each group to have its PM at a different month of the year, instead of having them all scheduled at the same month of the year, with the expectation of finishing it at the end of the month. Number two, to also maybe implement device locators so we can easily get to the pumps whenever we need them for maintenance. Recommendation number two was to strictly change batteries every 2 years at PM to reduce having dead battery issues appear. And number three was to implement a new policy of changing the power cords every 2 years because we don't have one currently at CHIO. And number four was to improve the clinical staff training on the handling of clinical advisories, and this can happen by distributing a list of clinical advisories and the right way to handle them to the nurse managers. So this is just a recap. I tried to identify the main reasons of failure and to check if they are in the procedure, and they appear to be. I tried to check the frequency and of the performed PMs, and it appeared that we were overdoing the PMs 47.8% of the time. I calculated the mean time between failure, and it was 11.4 months, and the PM was set to be at every 12 months, so that's good. And then to hopefully save on resources, it would be best if we can just implement the recommendations I had provided. Project assumption check. The manufacturer's PM is effective in terms of procedure and interval, but the recommendations may help a bit with optimizing the resources. Future work, it would be best if we can redo the assessment in 5 years after implementing the recommended adjustments, and then comparing the mean time between failure to see if it changes or not. That's it. Thank you so much for attending.
That's excellent. With 32 seconds to spare. Awesome timing, Lama. Very good. Really fascinating talk, because I think all of us in the biomed field, there are many different things that are very difficult to access and seem to grow legs and seem to hide in corners. Everyone hoards them. Infusion pumps are one of those wonderful little things. I'm really happy actually that you called out that the usage error is a significant thing. I was curious, just before we get into Adil reading some questions off from the audience, I'm curious, did you ever, as part of your follow-up, when you, two things. One, did you ever encourage more training when you had a string of the same no problem found, but the same error, reported error, that's the one. And then the second part of that is when you saw that, okay, we have all of these PMs being generated and published at the exact same time, which is ludicrous with respect to workload as well as access. I'm curious if you ever looked at the tech's vacation schedule in order to say, okay, let's do a third of the PMs in, say, this month or a quarter, and then a quarter, like just to break it out over the year, and also recognize when you're going to have available resources to even do the PMs.
That's a very good point. Unfortunately, I didn't check that, but now that you mentioned it, I just find it a very, very important thing to look at. So it just rang a bell, but no, I did not check it. For your other question, I think, what was the first question you mentioned? Sorry.
Training. Did you ever have enough
training.
of the,
Yes.
the same
so
no problem found errors?
Yes. So I actually did print a list of the things that clinical staff may face that were appearing in our database as problems, and then we would test them and we would find no problem found. So I did make a list. And I said that if we can just give this list to all the nurse managers, that would just, and they would just distribute it to the new nurses, that would really help us with like saving time and understanding devices. But again, I was told that because of how many nurses come to the training hospital, because TU is a training hospital, it's and the amount of medical equipment that they use with, like that they deal with, it's very difficult for them to actually go over every training instruction for every single device. So that's why we were getting these no problem found due to their inability to like just handle simple stuff like airline and occlusion.
Totally fair.
And that
totally
can
fair.
just like that can easily be solved with like a device restart or a reboot. But yeah.
Sounds good. Adil, I think we have time for a question from the audience.
So we actually have one question by Matthew. So he's asking, when calculating the mean time before failure, did you count failures of all types or only PM preventable failures?
Failure of all types. So we did failure of all types, and we didn't do it just like battery failures. We did it like in like failure of all kinds. Although the main failures were due to batteries, so I would say like a huge amount of like the mean time between failure was due to battery, because that's the main failure. But we did it for the entire problems. So all kind of select problems.
Awesome.
Excellent. Thank you, Lama. And thank you very much for joining us today on your break, on your brand new job. So I'm glad you could find some time for us. And very best of luck with your new position.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here. Appreciate your invitation, and have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Bye, everyone.
Marianne, if you'd like to introduce your next student.
Yes. The next student is from the Ottawa Heart Institute. His name is Eduardo Alcala Orozco. I hope I didn't punch this, but it's a beautiful name. Eduardo Alcala holds a Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Engineering from Monterrey Institute of Technology and Higher Education, Mexico. He did a research internship at the Institute of Biomedical Engineering with the University of New Brunswick, and is currently doing his clinical engineering internship at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute and pursuing a master's degree in biomedical engineering with a concentration in clinical engineering. He has been supervised by Stephanie Leto and Tim Zekutny. Please go ahead, Eduardo.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Sure. Okay, is everything good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Looks great.
Is there? Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for the introduction. I'm Eduardo, and the project I'm currently working on is a technology management program for the Ottawa Heart Institute Research Corporation. It's important to note that The University of Ottawa Carleton Institute is divided in the research side and the clinical side, and we are using all the expertise of our biomedical and our clinical departments to try to apply them and try to mimic all of the functional system we have in the biomedical department into research. We have in the background that the University of Ottawa Heart Institute is often requested some repairs and projects by the researchers to make, to make some of these repairs. Often when biomedical in, this equipment is not properly maintained, and that results in preventable failure due to not well regular maintenance, regular preventive and corrective maintenance. In the past, what happened is that each service was charged per labor, and many of the researchers do not have the funds to cover these service repairs. Also, there is an absence of life cycle management. There is necessary to have a plan after the purchase of each equipment, a 3, 5, 10-year plan. And also we have around 1,700 pieces of equipment without counting furniture. And this is all active equipment that has been poorly managed. We have 3 main objectives. The first one is to provide increased uptime. The second one is to provide some predictability into costs. And the third one is to provide some greater research equipment collaboration. In order to achieve this, it was necessary to develop a program and processes to ensure all of the research equipment is inventory and service work completed and documented. This service work includes scheduled and unscheduled maintenance, or better known as preventive and corrective maintenance. It was also important to manage the existing service contracts in order to identify new opportunities and efficiencies to support the uptime of each equipment, also to assist with contract renewals and to ensure the proper work. Then we have the collaboration with researchers on grant applications. In the last couple of months, we have working in what we call the Equipment Initiative, in which a researcher acquires a grant, and then the Biomedical department, through this program, is able to assist with the procurement, the documentation, the facilities review, and the installation. Then we have the facilitate the technology procurement and lifecycle management. As I mentioned before, the lifecycle management is very important. It takes time. You need the work history of each piece of equipment, and also it's necessary to address replacements and all kind of service, as well as contracts. If we think about the stakeholders, the main stakeholder will be the researchers. But if we go deeper, we have a lot of them. We have the principal investigators, we have the lab staff that includes the lab manager and the lab technicians, we have clinical coordinators, the finance department, administrators of both institutions, we have manufacturers, vendors, suppliers, the biomed department, and around we have graduate students and research fellows. We have third-party departments such as IT. We have laboratory services, the radiochemistry lab. We have funding organizations such as foundations or the NSERC. We have the facilities, and at the end we have the patient. Every research and the main objective is to improve the delivery of care. So we cannot use this program to the same objective that is the patient. We have several workflows. Since it's a new program, we have like around 7 or 8 different workflows, but the main ones and the ones I want to, for the means of this presentation, to show is the corrective maintenance, the preventive maintenance, the purchase request as part of the procurement. This is really high level, but first in the left side, we have the corrective maintenance workflow that is now happening. the researcher or some lab staff that works with a device, if this device stops working, meaning that probably is broken, can make a phone call or use a new management tool. It's important to know that we establish urgent or not urgent requests. It's not as simple as in the clinical side of life support matters. So it was needed to establish some details about what's urgent. So if it's urgent, I mean, for example, an animal or the staff is in in danger or could be injured because the device is not being maintained, it will be a phone call with a time response of 1 hour. If it's not urgent, they have the option of using a management tool, and it will take 2 business days, sorry. And then the biomed tech or engineer, could be anyone at the biomed department, will address the repair is going to see if it needs parts. If it needs parts, they're going to go to another workflow about purchase requests. If not, they are going to assess the repair, and everything is going to be documented. Since this program is new, we are starting to gather all of this information, and it's very important to have this work history of every device. For the preventive maintenance, we already have updated in our CMMS, that is the computerized maintenance management system, and all the PM data, we have everything updated. And now our BioMe manager is able to generate this monthly list that usually happens for the clinical side, but now is going to happen for each research equipment. Each biomed tech or engineer is going to review this list as usual, update the tool, and coordinate with researchers. They are going to initiate each PM and, as always, document everything. For the purchase request, we have that when a part, supplier, equipment is required, the researcher is going to use the same 2 options to contact the biomedical department. Also, a part could be required from service. Unfortunately, a PM could end in a corrective maintenance. And the biomedical or engineer is going to be responsible of contacting the vendor to negotiate a quote, obtain it, get a principal investigator approval, and if it's approved, to get the cost center for that to pass to the finance department at the end. But in the meanwhile, the MME department, the tech is going to create a POID in our database, and the administrator is going to use NAV, that is a specific portal for research, where it is very useful because everyone at the research institute is able to see each request. And for example, if a lab technician is requesting a part, the PI is going to get a notification from that portal or can check each request that is happening. And then when it's approved, Biomedical is going to order the part, supplier equipment, is going to do the proper incoming inspection, document everything, and as a last step, it could be the some training or installation assistance. This is a management tool, a really friendly user interface, who everyone at the institute with a Microsoft account could access. They can use it to request repairs, purchases, check the status of each request. Also, they can check monthly PMs. In the case of service contracts, they are going to have a quarterly and yearly notice about them. And they can also use this app for disposal and transfer of equipment to keep track of the assets. That it's really important. So this is an example of the form, really important information to gather for our CMMS. And the gallery view to check the status of each request. The program oversight is, we have had the long-term process of hiring a full-time BME technologist dedicated to research equipment. And this was very important to reduce the workflow, do not compromise what is happening in the clinical side, and by that the patients. So this new technologist is responsible of following the workflows, ensure the increase of time, of each piece of equipment, identify efficiencies and improvements, and manage the existing service contracts. It's important to note that that we have a whole team. We have the biomedical and the clinical engineering team supporting this program. So for example, for the imaging team, they could address problems with all of the imaging system, and for nuclear medicine with the cyclotron or radiochemistry lab with radionuclide synthesizers, for example, used both for clinical and for research. And also we have our senior clinical engineer that will assist with projects and grants and identify efficiencies as well. We have had an early impact in the institute so far in the last couple of months. We have worked with anesthesia machines, with ventilators, with centrifuges, with freezers, with MRIs, PET-CTs, spectrometers, microscopes, incubators, non-invasive blood pressure devices, and also more as water purification systems, cytometers, and so on. And the list keeps growing. We had to make a standard operational procedure to state the responsibilities of each department. Biomed is responsible of the corrective and preventive maintenance without charging the labor. This is really important. To do the proper income inspection, assist with delivery and installation, to do the proper contract management and issue purchase orders. To take care of the workload, it was necessary to do the exception of consumables, furniture, and fixtures, and also to provide the tool previously described. The research basically needs to cooperate. It's necessary to notify BME of new equipment and separate service contract requests, to provide the funding, to notify BME of problems with research equipment, and for grant applications, for now, is to cooperate with BME for equipment reviews, specifications, and pricing. But this will go deeper in the future. Our timeline is now in continuous analysis of the program, collaboration with grants, as mentioned before, and managing the life cycle. And these three are long-term. We need the work history, and we need data, and so on. For the analysis, we have quantitative or qualitative data. We are expecting an increase of time. And we already have good numbers in work orders. Comparing with the last 5 years, we have the same numbers just in 2 months. So this means that we had problems that weren't addressed in the past that are currently managed. In the PMs, we are trying to have good compliance of 80%. In the past, we had like 30 to 50% of compliance, so that's not so good. But now we are addressing the problem as well. The assets are getting high as well through the work orders, and we have received so many equipment without being assetted properly. For the savings, we need more information, but just in the last 2 months, we saved $2,000. And we are currently managed 3 times more of service contracts, which means that in the future we can, it's important to note that these contracts, most of them are full service contracts. So in the future, with the new staff, with the new technologies and this new program, we are going to be able to transition for shared service contracts, for just labor contracts, with training contracts, and more options. And we are expecting to make 2 surveys along this year, in 6 months and in 1 year, but we need to wait a little more. And this is the last slide. Just to mention an honorable mention to all the people that have been working the last year with this project. We had research representatives, both of my supervisor, Stephanie, and team has been supporting me so much. And from the research side, we have Ben Rothstein, Vivian Flankin, Marcelo Munoz, Ted Fatica, Christine Emerton. From the senior management committee, we have Dr. Peter Liu, Alison Hussey, and Gujen, and Timothy as well. I will leave this slide, but this is the end of of the presentation.
Thank you, Eduardo. Very interesting Very interesting talk. I like how your GUI had status checks both for repair and purchasing. It's nice to kind of be able to be right up to date. I think we have at least a couple of questions.
Sorry. I stopped sharing. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I think we have at least a couple of questions. Adil, would you like to pose the questions?
Sure. So Eduardo, Drew asked that does the purchasing process change with the class of the medical device that's being purchased? So class 1 versus class 4?
It's different depending on, I will say depends, because we are managing bench lab equipment. We're managing animal lab equipment. So maybe for the equipment that is in contact with patients for clinical trials, it will have similar purchasing, but for sure it's going to be different since some of this equipment is not in contact with patients.
Okay. Another question by Natalie was that what is the funding model for this new technology management service, considering the previous funding was chargeback for labor?
That's a good question. I mean, that's part of the institute budget. I mean, for sure, we are removing this labor because without removing this labor charge, it wasn't possible for the researcher to receive this maintenance. But I will get back to you with how because the project was this part of that funding budget was previously funded before I started the project. So it was that budget was previously addressed to make this program possible.
Okay, so it was sort of done prior to.
Yeah,
it was approved at the time you came in.
Yeah, it was prior to at least that part. Yes.
Okay. On a similar note, so Chris asks that who funds the BME research position, and is the individual responsible for equipment that is in use in other departments that also may be used for research?
Could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
So who funds the biomedical engineering technologist research position? And is this individual responsible for equipment that may be used for research in other departments as well?
I don't know if I catch that properly, but I mean who funds the research technologist? I mean, it's part of the biomedical team. It's not just for research. In fact, it has a secondary duty of supporting the team as well as this program is part of the whole team. So every technologist is responsible of maintaining research equipment. It's just that we have one dedicated, as well as we have 3 different teams, as the imaging team that is dedicated to imaging systems, but also take care of other equipment. So it's being, I mean, it's part of the same team. And the second part of the question, I didn't catch that. Sorry.
That's okay. I think we're at time for there because we want to make sure we save some time for Chris. I noticed there are also a couple of questions that were posted in the chat. If you could post your questions in the Q&A, we'll try and get to those. Clearly, with only 5 minutes of Q&A, there's only so many questions we can ask, but we will be posting the presentations, and maybe the questions that aren't answered that we have, we'll try and get answers for those, and either email folks directly if you want to email your questions, or we'll try and find some way to get you the answers. So with that, thank you very much, Eduardo.
Thank you so much.
Chris, if you'd like to share your video and your screen.
Chris. Okay. So the next presenter is Chris Gray. Chris is originally from a small town outside of London, Ontario, and studied biomedical science during his undergrad at University of Guelph. While completing his Master's of Engineering at University of Ottawa, he worked as a clinical engineer intern at the Ottawa Hospital under the supervision of Andrew Ivey. So Chris,
Thank
go
you,
ahead.
Marianne. Is my screen visible to everybody?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So I will be giving my presentation today, and it is really about some novel metric-based models that we developed for staffing and workload balancing among biomedical technicians at our hospital. So just a quick overview, I'll go over the main points of the project. I'll talk a little bit about a survey that we performed across Canada, and I will get to both of those models that I mentioned before we wrap things up. So the main goals of this presentation were really this project rather were two things. First of all was to create metric-based models for determining staffing levels and workload normalization for our biomedical engineering technologists. And there were two reasons for this. The first was that the models that we were using at TOH were sort of outdated and not really based on any metrics. And I think you'll see where some of the imbalances have come from that in this presentation. The other part is to have some metric-based justifications for business cases and talking to our upper management at TOH. There was also a second part of this project, which was a survey that we performed at various clinical engineering departments across Canada. And I'll get into a little bit of the details of that survey right now. So this was, I'll try to weave this into the metric based models as well, but this was a voluntary survey that we asked people to take part in, and this was done by CMBES administrators, directors, managers, clinical engineers, or really anybody who was available to take part in this. We had 13 different participants representing different centers from BC, Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario. And it was sort of a semi-structured interview that took place over the phone. There were set questions that everybody was asked, but people were encouraged to elaborate on different parts. And there was a lot of interesting anecdotes that came out of it. A lot of it focused on PM programs and how people structure their PM programs, but there were other things about staffing and workload balancing as well. And the main purpose of this was, first of all, to have a benchmark to compare TOH against, and also just it ended up being really interesting to see what different departments are doing across the country. Some of the challenges with this were 13 different hour-long interviews were actually a huge workload, and for me to go through all those interviews and analyze the transcripts and the field notes took a lot of time, and it was difficult to summarize all that information down succinctly and get it to fit into this report and even more so into this presentation, which is quite short. So I can't really get into a lot of the details of all the survey, but one part that I thought was really interesting that I'd like to share today is looking at the PM programs in Canada. Some of the things that we're looking at are how closely departments are following manufacturer recommended PMs, their procedures and frequencies, and how this affects their PM compliance. And I think this illustrates one of the reasons why metric-based staffing models can be helpful. So there's lots of examples in the literature, and I think also anecdotally, even like Lama touched on briefly that PM frequencies and procedures from manufacturers are too frequent or too cautious, and they're really focused on litigation rather than the actual needs for the device. And we were curious because of this of how closely centers were following manufacturer recommended PMs. What we found was that it was an even split between centers generally following recommended PMs, and this was either they made slight adjustments to the frequency or the procedure just based on their experience. And there was also a group that was, or another 6 of the 13 participants who have a committee that decides on the PM's frequency and procedure. And I think this part is interesting in particular when we look at the PM compliance. So we asked centers what their targets were for their PM completion and what their actual PM compliance was. And there was a really clear trend that the actual PM compliance was quite a bit lower than the target PM compliance. This is for the 6 centers that split their compliance into normal risk devices and high risk devices. And the trend was the same in the centers that just look at all of their PM compliance together. And TOH would look similar to this. I think we essentially have a target of 100%, and our PM compliance is closer to 50% as a total. And the part that I thought was interesting about this with the PM programs is that the highest PM compliance come from the centers that have the most stringent PM criteria or for what they include on PM. There were a few different centers that said they were quite aggressive with what they removed from their PMs right from the get-go, and that allowed them to focus more on the PMs that they thought were more important and really remove the ones that they didn't think were important. But this seems to be a really consistent problem with everybody. It was really common to hear that people were drowning in workload. That came up a lot. And one of the other centers that had a high compliance said the only reason that they were so high in compliance is because they were drowning in overtime. So this seems to be a challenge for nearly every department. And there's various ways that people are getting around their PM compliance. So, and I think this could be one of the reasons why a staffing model or workload balancing model could be helpful to see what a workload is actually like, and make decisions on whether you need more staff to complete your PMs more effectively. So I'll try to get through both these models quickly. So this staffing model was created to try to understand all of the work that we have to do, our technicians, technologists have to do in a year, and forecast that out to see how many staff we need to cover it. So of course, we wanted to capture our preventive maintenance, and we did this by looking at our PM durations, which is the time that we expect a technologist to take to complete a certain task. So we took the sum of, for each model of device, the sum of all of the PM durations over a 3-year period, divided that by the active devices that we own, and divided that by 3 to get an average PM duration per device per year. And that really gives us an idea of how much time we think each device will need for PMs each year. And a similar calculation was done for corrective maintenance, where again, we were looking at historical data to see how much time we usually spend on corrective maintenance on devices, and use that to have an estimate of how much time each device will need for corrective maintenance in the future. And finally, one of the pieces that we wanted to capture as well, which is a little bit more challenging, was some of the project and miscellaneous work that's done by technologists. This is things like new installs, meetings, even education on the floor. But we found that this is a lot more difficult to capture, and our data is not nearly as clean for this. I think this is really well illustrated here. So we capture this project and miscellaneous time using virtual assets at the Ottawa Hospital. And this is a look at some of our different staff members and how much time they have logged for virtual assets, essentially project and miscellaneous work. And there is a huge amount of variation in how techs are recording this work, which again makes it difficult to have a really good, accurate number for how much time we're spending on project and miscellaneous time. Could be a lot of reasons for this. Could be a lack of clear expectations and SOPs for tracking this work, or just our tech's preference for how they want to track their work. And this type of work is a little bit harder to define and therefore a little bit harder to track. Ultimately, though, for the numbers that we have from 2016 to 2020, we're spending approximately 10.3% of all of our hours on project and miscellaneous work. And that is the factor that was used for this model. So here's an example of a calculation for how you could look at how many staff you would need for TOH to perform all of the maintenance and work on devices over a year. So we summed up all of the PMs for all of our devices, all of our CMs for all of our devices, and then used this factor of 10.3% for miscellaneous work to come up with around 24,750 hours per year. Now, we estimate that our techs have roughly 1,125 productive hours per year. This is a number that Payal Mandot, one of our clinical engineers and a previous intern, came up with in her research project. And using that, we can see how many technologists, full-time technologists, we would need to perform this amount of work. And that comes out to about 22 full-time equivalents. I also used, just to give a bit of a range, a 20% virtual assets factor. So 20% of our time being in projects and miscellaneous work, because we do think that 10.3% is quite an underestimate. And even so, that would come out to around 23.9 full-time equivalents. TOH currently has 23.4 full-time equivalents, or at least it was when I left in December. So we fall roughly in the range that is given by this model, which makes our 50% PM compliance a little bit difficult to explain, because based on this, we think we have about the right number of staff, but that might be something that we need to look into in the future. So I'll quickly try to cover this. I only have a few minutes left here. But this was done in a really similar way, looking at how much time each of our technologists will need to spend to complete all of their workload for a year. This was, we assign our devices to individuals and they're responsible for all the work. So using those same calculations of how many PM hours and CM hours are expected for a device, we can make an estimate of how many hours a tech will need to work in a year. So this really came out because our workload balancing was pretty lopsided. We found out it was based on a hunch from one of our old CMMS administrators, just giving people 400 to 500 PM hours per year, but that's resulted in quite an imbalance, as you can probably see here, with some people way over this expected 1,125 hours per year, and some people way below. I'm just going to skip over this other graph because of time, but there have been efforts now to balance the workload more at TOH using this model. It's still not perfect, obviously, but this is one way that we can try to make our workload balancing a little bit less lopsided. And there are obviously some limitations to this type of model. It's pretty rigid, and in talking with a lot of the people in our survey, they brought up really good points that this doesn't really take into account your professional experience or some of the knowledge you might have about strengths and weaknesses of your different technologists. So I think this is a good starting point, but should really be combined with more professional knowledge. And quickly, just some conclusions. So these metric-based models are maybe a good starting point to understand your workload and tackle some resource allocation, but it really relies on accurate data entry. So you need to be sure that accurate data entry is being used across the board. And finally, I think one of the interesting things I found during this project was that everybody we talked to was really interested about what other centers were doing. And I hope that there is more data sharing between hospitals, because yeah, I think everybody's really curious what other hospitals are doing and what challenges they're having and how they're tackling it. So just a thank you to everybody, all the survey participants. I really appreciate your time. The institutions who made this internship for me possible. Joelle and Mark, the clinical managers at TOH, and especially Andrew Ivey, my supervisor, gave me an unbelievable amount of support during the internship in this project, and I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Excellent, excellent, well-timely research always. It's kind of funny, but it seems like every few years we do a refinement on the staffing models, and I really appreciate that you've done this update. And even when you have the best staffing models, sometimes you're still challenged in why the heck aren't our PM numbers better? And I think it comes down to a couple of really key things that the people who are higher up need to not just look at staffing models, but look at some fundamental of how our staff are being interfaced and used. Because for instance, are they aligning PM issuance with vacations, not only for the techs, but also the clinical staff? So take advantage of summer slowdowns, pre-book access to chunks of equipment blocks, because you could have the best tech, but if they can't get access to the device, it's kind of hard for them to do the PM. And then really reinforce with clinical folks that it's in their best interest to give us access to the devices so that we can do the PM. Like, okay, it's not great that you have to give up a day of surgeries, but do you want to be in compliance or not? Especially if you're doing research, because then you almost have no choice. But really, really good presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Adil, I think we have a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah, a couple. So Chris, Kenneth is asking that, is there intent on expanding the sites consulted for PM data to include those in Quebec? And if not, can you please just lend some insight as to why Quebec may not have been included?
Yeah, so we would have been really interested to have anybody participate. I tried to send this out to as many people as possible. A lot of it was just through the contacts of the staff at TOH, but it was a pretty short period of time that we had to try to recruit people to schedule these meetings and to have the surveys done in enough time to get them into this research report by the end of my internship. So it was really just a matter of access to people, and we would have liked to have people from Quebec, Saskatchewan, the East Coast. Yeah, and that would be something great to do in the future, maybe if we had a little bit more time and we were a bit more organized.
Awesome. An anonymous attendee, they're asking that, on what basis was it determined that techs only have 1,125 productive hours compared to their annual working hours of 1950?
Yeah, so you can find the paper that Payel wrote. She won an award for it a few years ago through ACCE, and I think it really just took into account all of the possible hours that they could work in a year, subtracted their vacation, the sick days that we estimated that the techs take from our previous data, and then used a productivity factor of 70%, if I'm not mistaken, and that was taken from an older paper published in AME. I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, it was essentially taken from HR data and this productivity factor of 70% that they expected techs to be working in a normal day.
And thank you. And then maybe last question, I know we're a bit over time. So for future research, how would you assess the accuracy of data entry, especially for recording of time?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that was really difficult, because these models don't really make any sense if we don't have accurate data entry. One of the things we tried to do to assess if our PM durations were accurate and useful was, I was also asking centers for their PM durations, either the ones that they had from techs actually performing procedures, or from their forecasted PM durations. And we compared ours to those to try to make sure that was accurate. I think projects in the miscellaneous piece would be the most important part to make sure we are doing accurate data entry. To assess it, I'm not really sure what the best way to do that would be. I think perhaps it might be to take a look at some of the technologists that you know are really doing a good job at entering that data entry, and compare those numbers to some of the other technologists. We had one tech that you might have seen who had a huge amount of hours logged to projects. And in speaking to him, he was very, very diligent in how he went about recording every hour of time in meetings, installs, and really anything. And I think it might be useful to try to compare somebody who's really doing a good job at being accurate to somebody who might be a little bit more loose in how they're recording their time.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's typically inversely proportional how good you're doing your documentation with how many hours you have available to do other documentation.
Yeah.
It's always
Yeah.
That'd be interesting research for future research, just see, okay, how can we optimize the documentation part? Because it's important, but if you only have 1125, if you can increase that number, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, and everybody, and that was something that a lot of the participants were talking about as or that had mentioned as well, that if finding that balance between having people document accurately but not creating an environment where they're feeling forced to just record something and they're just fudging their numbers essentially. So yeah,
that's not so good. We often don't like to talk about that one, but it's still an issue that we deal with all the time. So thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much, Dr. Janvier, to you and your team. Very interesting research, and I know I actually want to do a little side thank you to Tim Zakutny and Andrew Ibe, because I know they were involved in the research there as well. So excellent. As I mentioned, this is our first foray into this new format where we provide a forum for students to present. I know there are a couple of questions that we weren't able to answer because it is a very compressed format. And in addition to the exactly scheduled hour, it's actually 2:09, so it's not too bad because we have a little bit of overhead for introducing the speaker and a few other things. So thank you very much for bearing with us on that. We are looking forward to coming sessions. We're in negotiations with other university groups to get them scheduled. For April, what I'd like to announce is that I'll actually be giving a webinar for the next one, and it's a new. We're exploring a couple of different formats, and one of them that we were talking about is what we call a survivor's guide to. So the webinar that I'm going to be presenting is a survivor's guide to electromagnetic compatibility in clinical engineering practice. So it's pretty fundamental. It's right in the SOPs, which actually we're reviewing right now. So it's a very fundamental thing. So it's almost like a reminder for folks who have been in the business and have gray hairs like me, or if you're just getting into the business, a little, here's where you want to go to find this different information. Maybe a little check, because in researching the standards of practice, I get to hear from people across the country for people who do a little bit slightly different approach to spectrum management and EMC control across the country. So that's actually really fascinating. So I'd actually like to present that in the way I handle it with our hospitals. So so that'll be in April. We'll determine the exact dates and such, and we'll get that out to you. But we just wanted to give you a little advice as to which the next one is. And with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for attending today. It's always appreciated. And I look forward to when we can get together again.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Au revoir tout le monde.